Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our participants for the Economic Justice Panel. Lori Lotus with the Center for American Progress Action Fund, Rohit Chopra with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, Michael Linden with the Center for American Progress, and Sarah Lewis with the AFL-CIO.
Hello. Hello. So we're going to start off with a couple of questions for our panelists up here, and then I'm going to open it up to y'all. You can tweet your questions, #MakeProgress, and I'll find them, I promise. So we're just going to go right into it. We'll start with you, Michael. The name of today's panel is A Conversation on Economic Justice. We're going to talk about the economy. It's a really huge subject and tends to be more than a little bit confusing, especially for those of us who don't spend all day in offices in DC reading the Financial Times or debating Keynes versus Kropotkin. I have the best parties, you guys. So I want to turn it over to you, Michael, to kind of frame this conversation. In the simplest terms that you can come up with, what are we talking about when we talk about the economy? Is it like magnets? Do we know how they work? And
I don't know how magnets work.
and how is the economy working or not working for young people today?
I mean, this is a big question, obviously, but it's kind of a fundamental one. For the last 30 years, we have been told, or certainly the conversation in Washington has been dominated by a theory of how the economy works that starts with those at the top, people who have been successful, or maybe their parents were successful, or maybe their great-grandparents were successful. And the theory was, if we devise policies that will help them, the prosperity will, trickle down, as it were, to everybody. And of course, that has been a pretty dramatic failure. And it's failed not just because it was never really well thought out, but we now know that there's actually really good evidence that the economy works the best when the broad middle is the focus of policy, when we're saying, okay, let's make sure that everyone has the opportunity to achieve their full potential. Every single person in this country is their own little mini engine of growth. It's not the top 1%, it's everybody. And if we remove barriers from people's potential, then they will create great new inventions, they will start new businesses, they will find efficiencies, they'll do all sorts of things that help everybody. So it's not top down, it's very much middle out. And I think that's a new conception of the way the economy works, but it's one that there's a lot of empirical backing for, and it's one that actually has a lot of resonance with a lot of people.
So I'm going to turn to Rohit. There's one personal financial issue that is close to the hearts of all the folks in this room right now and to millions of people in the US, and that's student debt. I've personally spoken with economists from Paul Krugman to Joe Stiglitz about this issue, and Mark Zandi, who's with Moody's, you guys read the news in the past 10 years, you've heard this name. He gave me my favorite answer about the student debt problem. He said to me, and I quote, "Student loans are not a macroeconomic problem. It's only $1 trillion, which macroeconomically speaking it's a fairly small amount. And the majority of these loans are subsidized by the federal government. So even though they've been securitized and sold throughout the financial industry, even if everyone defaults all at once, it's not going to have the echo effect through the economy that the housing bubble had." I think even folks who've never read the first bit of economic theory can see the fallacy in this argument. But what are your thoughts on that question? Both the fact that there's $1.2 trillion in student loan debt right now, and that many individuals and families are facing 5 and, in my case, 6 figures of student loan debt.
Yeah, The student debt is unquestionably strangling a lot of people, and I think to say that it's not having a broader impact is in some ways maybe naive. You know, so many of us have been tracking this market for some time, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing. And like you said, $1.2 trillion. And you know what's frustrating is that many people in Washington don't really look at it urgently, because it's not going to cause financial institutions to collapse. It's not going to cause some immediate doomsday, but the long-term effect can be very, very real. And I'll tell you specifically, Chairman Bernanke has talked about how first-time home buyers aren't really getting back into the market, and that has a cascading effect on the rest of the economy, because other families, they can't buy bigger homes, and it just doesn't make the market grow as quickly. But it could be, and many of us believe, that student debt is a culprit in keeping younger people out of the housing market. And you know, there's a statistic recently that was released about, there are about 6 million younger Americans living with their parents. This is a very sharp increase from 5 years ago. And you know, just speaking personally, I deeply love my parents, but I don't want to live with them. And the idea that it's that cultural—
Are they watching right
yeah,
now?
Right? That cultural pundits say, oh, you know, younger people, they just can't get away from mom and dad. And I think this is unbelievable. Many of those young people are employed, but are struggling with a lot of economic issues, including battling a lot of debt. So, and it's not just the housing market, it's younger people not necessarily wanting to start a small business or be an entrepreneur, not being able to save for retirement. And so while there may not be a doomsday, there could be a real drag that we'll regret if we don't address.
Right, thanks. So I'm come to you, Lori. So student debt has been one subject that's really gotten a lot of people talking, marching, calling their representatives, and you know, just recently. And then in 2011, 2012, Occupy's big success, arguably, was getting people to talk about economic inequality here in the United States and around the world. What is your perspective on the current state of the political narrative and the economic inequality? And what are people doing about economic and social inequality? And can you tell us what you think has led up to these changes in the dialogue?
You're completely right. Occupy really started this moment where it became okay to actually talk about the economy, and more importantly, okay to talk about this mass inequality between the folks in the 1% and the rest of us. And it sort of created this opening where we could have a more fruitful discussion about student debt, about wages, about CEO pay that was, you know, going up hundreds of times quicker than the average salary for a worker. And that really led into 2012. And one of the unique characteristics of the 2012 election was that it was fundamentally about two very different visions of how the economy works. And that's a little bit different. It wasn't necessarily that way in 2008 or in 2004. And as Michael laid out, these very fundamental differences in how the economy works really galvanized the American people, and is why President Obama is still in the White House. Because you had, for lack of a better word, a poster child of how I think the economy should not work as the Republican nominee. Mitt Romney was everything that we had been talking about during Occupy. He was not only the 1%, he was the 0.00001%. And he was paying a tax rate, you know, lower, much lower than the average American. And it really set up this choice. You know, what sort of economy do we want? What sort of economy do we think actually will create job growth and create prosperity? And I think what you saw in the election was that people said, progressives are right. We cannot continue to give more and more to the top thinking that it's going to trickle down and create jobs, because it hasn't been working. We actually saw the complete opposite before President Obama, where they actually put trickle-down economics into practice. And what we really need is to invest in jobs, invest in the middle class, and grow our economy from the middle out. And that really became one of the drivers of the election and one of the issues that I know all of us on this stage, I realize you're doing an economy panel at the end of lunch, and thankfully most of you seem awake. But it really is, like, these issues that we're talking about underscore everything else. And the economy and how it works, and whether you can get a job, whether you can afford to buy healthcare, which thank God on October 1st, young people and everyone else can enroll in insurance if they don't already have it. You have no idea how happy that makes me to hear you clap for healthcare. It's great. But these issues are so critical to who we are as a country and where we're going to be in the next generation.
It's great. And while I have you, Lori, I want to talk about the big economic issue that my organization is perhaps best known for screaming about. That's jobs and the high rate of youth unemployment. Right now, the unemployment rate for our youngest workers is twice or more that of the overall unemployment rate. Recent college graduates are grossly underemployed. I have friends I graduated with law school with who are working temp jobs, agency jobs, jobs they're just not using their skill set for, right? Well, let's talk about that. What the hell is going on? What can and should be done to solve the problem of youth and underemployment?
There's a theory that has really been dominating conversations for the past 30 years. Michael touched on this, which is that we can basically cut our way out of this. If we keep on cutting education, from everything from Pell Grants to Head Start, if we cut programs for people who are low income, if we cut programs for veterans and for children on military bases, that we can actually somehow mysteriously create jobs. And we know that that's just not, we cannot cut our way to growth. We cannot cut our way to prosperity. So what do we need to do? We need to get the people working again. We need to make sure that there's opportunities for young people not only to get a job, but to get a good job with good benefits that you can actually live on. And so one of the things we've got to figure out is, how do we do that, right? And I think there's a lot of ideas out there, but it really comes back to investing. We need the government to invest in our future. And we do that by, there is I'm sure many of you took buses or planes to get here. You've driven down streets, at least this week, and they're crumbling. Bridges are crumbling. We should be fixing those now, not, I don't know when. Interest rates are very low. Money is affordable for us to actually spend in investing in our country, but we're not doing that. And that's what we need to get back to, and that's what we actually need why we need all of you to get involved, is because people are not going to listen unless we make them listen and make them understand that we can't wait to create jobs, that we actually need to do it right now.
Can I just add a point about service members and veterans, where of younger people, so many of them in this age group have served our country and have come back. And if we look at after World War II and the GI Bill, veterans were a critical part of a major economic upswing to be able to come back, start families, start small businesses. But what we're seeing now is so many veterans who are also facing very high unemployment rates are the target of very aggressive recruiting tactics by certain actors in the for-profit college industry. They're able to collect their GI Bill benefits, and we just hear repeatedly at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau about wounded warriors, veterans with traumatic brain injury being targeted to recruit them to some of these colleges. And I just think no matter what you think about foreign policy, we owe it to think about that veterans are able to be part of economic progress rather than just saddling them with debt.
You know, Rohit, I was really excited there for a moment because Lori had kind of ended on this empowering, exciting, upbeat note, and then. So we'll just continue with the depressing questions. How's that sound? So come back to you, Michael, and we've been talking about the high rate of unemployment among young folks and education debt, and especially with Lori's comments, it's very clear that there's a lot that Congress could and should be doing right now to make things better for young people as well as the overall economy. And at the AFL-CIO, we have a favorite phrase that sequester is just a fancy word for a really bad idea. So let's talk about fiscal policy sequester. First of all, what do we mean by fiscal policy? It's a pretty arcane term outside of DC. And how is the government's current fiscal policy affecting young people?
Yeah, this is an important question. I mean, if we, talking about the economy, and let's get really exciting and talk about fiscal policy, right? 'Cause I know that's what you're all here to talk about. So when we talk about fiscal policy, what we mean is what the federal government spends and what they take in taxes and how they do those things. And really, I think it's fair to say that fiscal policy over the last 3 years has been pretty much backwards. We have been focused on cutting, as Lori was talking about. We have been focused on cutting programs that are going to have benefits for us in the future under this completely wrong-headed idea that we need to reduce our deficit today, right now, immediately. I think we probably do have a long-term fiscal challenge, and when I say long-term, I mean 10 years from now, 15 years from now. But there's no reason to be cutting things that will have benefits, that will pay off in the long run. Let me give you a really concrete, it's a small but a concrete example. So the House GOP just passed an appropriations bill that funds a bunch of different things. And one of the things that it's supposed to fund is lead paint removal, lead abatement. Okay, it sounds really small, very minor, but what we know from scientific fact, I know science is kind of a bad word among conservatives, but what we know, it's not funny.
We laugh to keep from crying.
Yeah, but we absolutely know for a fact that lead exposure in young children can have long-lasting effects on their academic achievement. It's been associated with crime, and getting rid of lead pays off enormously. Okay, so knowing all of that, you'd imagine, right, that the House Republican budget increases funding for this incredible program, and it's a huge program, $150 million, right, tiny program. And so we could totally spend another $150 million on that. No, they cut it in half, right? That's ridiculous. It's exactly opposite of what we are doing. If we want to talk about investing in young people, from the very youngest to people in college and just after college, we should be spending more money on those sorts of things. And it pays off. It pays off in lower crime. It pays off in more educational achievement and better jobs down the road. And so when we talk about fiscal policy, it gets a little bit arcane, as you said, but what we're talking about is these specific programs that actually help real people and make real differences in both individual people's lives, but in the broader economy as well. So, I can't emphasize enough what Lori said. We have to really pay attention to these little tiny things because they make a huge difference.
And so now I'll go to Rohit with a similarly, though perhaps more arcane topic, the monetary policy. So generally, monetary policy is the Federal Reserve's policies of buying and selling debt in order to keep a certain amount of money active in the economy, keep banks lending, et cetera. Now, last week, I think it was, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke once again stated that the Fed is going to focus on keeping interest rates as low as possible and continuing on with their current policies. However, current evidence dictates that young people have been actively deleveraging, getting rid of their debt, and aren't making home and auto purchases for which they may take out debt, loans from banks, due at least partially to the fact that many of us are saddled with $20,000 or more in student loan debt. Now, for the most part, student loan interest rates are set by legislation, and the loans themselves are not, you're not able to refinance them. So what effect does monetary policy that we hear about every other day in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, what effect does that actually have on young folks?
Well, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, we really look closely after consumer financial markets. And while we don't set these interest rates, of course we pay really close attention. And for all of you who may not be familiar with some of these interest rate policies, the idea is that if interest rates are lower in the market, then it stimulates the economy because people will want to borrow money to buy a home, or they'll be able to refinance their debt, putting more money in their pockets. And so if you think about the three challenges that new college grads face, it's kind of a three-part obstacle course. So the first is landing a job. The second is finding a home or an apartment. And the third is really tackling your student debt. Now, monetary policy and low interest rates, it's really unclear how it's helped young people do any of those three. So if you look at the job market, a lot of the new jobs that have been created through the recovery have actually been lower wage jobs that are hourly. And so almost half the unemployed in America are actually younger households. When it comes to renting an apartment or buying a home, low interest rates have actually had it looks like a real impact on higher real estate prices, which ironically is making it tougher for a lot of young people who have to rent and tougher to get in the housing market. And then, of course, their student debt there's dysfunction in the student loan market has meant that borrowers haven't been able to really take advantage of today's historically low interest rates, lower their payments, put more money in their pocket to spend. So I think many of us are worried that we need to take a close look at monetary policy and whether it may be pushing some young people back rather than pulling them forward. And so we got to take a close look at that and also have to make sure that student loan borrowers can refinance their debt, just like people with mortgages who've been able to lower their payments, just like people with credit card debt have been beneficiaries of monetary policy. It looks like student loan borrowers just aren't really being benefited from it. And if you look at the debate today that's been going on in Washington about student loan interest rates, this is really about $28 billion of loans that will be made next year, which is about 2% of the $1.2 trillion that's out there. So the whole system has to be looked at so that things start working.
That's just one of several ways that we treat student loan debt differently from other kinds of debt. For example, students can't discharge their debt in bankruptcy, which is different than most other kinds of debt, which is kind of unfair.
Yeah, and younger households, if they mostly have student debt, 40% according to the Federal Reserve of households have student debt. And if younger households are not being able to benefit from low interest rates, I think economic historians will look back and say, why didn't we get this right?
So before I turn the conversation over to questions from y'all at #MakeProgress on Twitter, I want to try to end on a somewhat bright note. Bring it back in, Lori. So this last question goes to the group as a whole, and I think everyone out here should be thinking about it as well. What can young people do today, tomorrow, next week, at home, on campus, while they're here in DC, to help change the economy so that it does work for everyone? I think my suggestion is obvious. Join or organize a union at your workplace. Sign up with Working America. Bridget is out there to sign you up right now. But I'd like to hear your suggestions. What can all of these fabulous young people here today do to fight inequality and bad economic policies and fix this mess?
I'll start. So I think
Thank you.
I'll be come on, people. So I think one of the important things for us to think about is that what's happening right now is going to affect your lives, all of our lives, for a generation to come. So if we don't change the direction of our policies, if we don't start investing, if we don't start getting people back to work, that's not only going to affect your earning potential today, it's going to have this multiplier effect, but also that's going to continue. And so Sarah's right. It's like, what can you do? And I think the number one thing you can do is to actually speak up. Get educated and speak out, because right now your voices, sadly, are not being heard on a lot of these issues in Washington, and they really need to be. What young people, what Campus Progress did last year around student loans was amazing. And for the first time, there was this like powerful youth bloc who was not only making their voices heard back in their communities, but were coming to Washington and making sure their members of Congress knew not to double my rate. Not the best example, perhaps, with what has happening right now, but I think there are a lot of things that people can do, but what you have to do is have faith in your voice and that your voice does matter. And that means finding opportunities to get involved with AFL, finding opportunities to get involved with Campus Progress, find ways to get involved with Organizing for Action. There are so many groups across this country fighting for the middle class, fighting for jobs. We just need more people to get invested in making that argument and making sure that it's heard. And so, I mean, this is sort of, I hope it's not too vague, but I really cannot stress enough that it really takes just speaking out. If that's an LTE, if it's writing for your school newspaper, if it's, you know, writing a letter to your member of Congress, all of these little things seem little, but they're pretty big. And when you put all of your voices together, that's huge. And that's what we really need right now, is more people understanding that their voices do count and to really speak out.
I think I have a similar point, which is, you know, yesterday on the Senate floor, Elizabeth Warren was chairing the session, and she announced that the Senate, after 2 years, have voted to confirm Rich Cordray as the first director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And one of the pieces of what we do every day is to make sure that when consumers complain, when they speak up, that actually some agency is looking out to make sure that when you're trying to navigate a mortgage or a student loan or a credit card, that everyone has to follow the law. This is good for, you know, honest lenders who want to play by the rules, but it's good for consumers too. And it means that when you hear about your friends or your colleagues who are struggling with student loans or any other financial product, it's not the time to be ashamed. It's the time to actually do something about it. Whether it's filing a complaint with us to get you know, the bank to fix the mistake that they might have made, or to educate yourself about how to take on the right financial products and so you can get ahead. You know, at consumerfinance.gov, we have so much that we can offer consumers and for you to be part of policy making. That means chiming in on rules that we might be thinking about, chiming in on where you've had problems with mortgages, student loans, and credit cards. And now that we're here, it's important that you not just look out for yourself, but for each other, and a lot of difference can be made with that.
Solidarity.
Yeah. So I'm going to build on both on what both of my colleagues have just said. But so I want to make a quick analogy. You know, we are winning the marriage equality fight, right? It's a good thing. Yeah. And one of the reasons we're winning is because your generation, our generation, is just it just makes sense. It's just obvious to us, right? It's not an issue. You know, we look around, we're like, what? Why are we even discussing this? We need to do the same thing for economic policy in this generation. We need it to be obvious to us and to all of our friends and our colleagues and our peers that the economy works the best when it's working for everybody. And if we can convince our friends and our peers of that, then we're going to grow up as a generation, and when we're in charge, which is going to be sooner than you think, it's going to just be obvious that that's the way the economy works, and that's the way it works best. And so I do think we need to focus very much, not just on, we need to speak out, we need to make sure that we're, you know, making use of the tools that we have at our disposal, and we also need to be convincing our peers, because the conservatives have lost the marriage equality. They lost the marriage equality fight 10 years ago. They just didn't know it yet. And we need to do the same thing for economics.
And I want to add one thing. Social media, for the love, go to Facebook, use Twitter, Tumblr, do whatever to Tumblr. Talking
Lori,
quickly.
totally you can't say our generation anymore.
I know. Well,
You're out.
to be fair,
You're out. Hey, are you on Friendster?
I will say that I did have a Tumblr back in 2007. Okay, just as a little bit of cred. But to Michael's point, that's how we're going to expand this, right? We are going to expand this by making sure that you're bringing your peers into this, and you're going to do that, not only through one-on-one conversations and in your classes and in your neighborhoods, but using Facebook, using all of the tools at your disposal, but really making sure that people get the message however possible.
It's awesome. So we only have a few minutes left, and I know the four of us could probably talk about this for eternity. So I want to pull a couple of questions off of Twitter, just throw them out to you, and see if we can wrap up in like 2 to 3 minutes. One question we've got on Twitter is about the minimum wage. Should we be pushing against a higher minimum wage, and what can we do to push for a higher minimum wage? And we'll start with there. And we've got one specifically for Lori. You discussed infrastructure projects. What is the importance of utilizing American labor and materials on these projects? And
Wow.
yeah.
A question that gets to my heart. So I worked in labor for many years, starting in campaigns in my home state of Oklahoma. And honestly, we built our middle class brick by brick. And we did that with American labor. The reason why the middle class is where it was, unfortunately, is because of unions. And I realize today, unfortunately, labor is not today where it was 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. But the reality is, if we want to build a strong middle class, if we want to build a strong country, the American unions are central to all of that. But I want to talk about the minimum wage really quick, because there's going to be a lot of battles, ballot initiatives, legislative fights over the next year to raise the minimum wage. And this is a no-brainer. We should not be, we're really going to fight over the minimum wage being raised from $7 to $10 or whatever. We need people to have the money. They can put a roof over their head, that they can buy food for their kids, that they can send their kids, give their kids the opportunity to succeed, and that takes a good wage. And I don't know if Michael has anything, because I know we do a lot of work around the minimum wage.
You're going to hear, when we talk about the minimum wage, you're going to hear conservatives say it's going to destroy jobs. That's what you're going to hear. You're going to hear them say, well, if you raise wages, then small businesses won't be able to hire people, and you're all just going to be screwed. That's what they're going to say. And it's just not true. Okay, we actually have good, strong academic, empirical evidence that if you raise the minimum wage, it's not going to destroy jobs, it's going to create them. And if you think about it, it makes a lot of sense. Over the last 30 years, American productivity has gone through the roof. American workers are more productive than ever. They are producing more than ever at faster and better ways, and their wages have not kept up. And so when you think about it, so who is benefiting from all of these incredible increases in productivity? Where is all that benefit going? Well, it's being captured by those at the very top, and we've seen that in the income numbers. If you raise the minimum wage, all you're really doing is shifting some of that benefit that is being created by workers themselves back to the workers. And that doesn't destroy jobs, it creates them. It means that they're going to be even more productive. It means that they're going to come up with some new ideas, new ways to do things more efficiently. So I just want to strongly push back against any notion that raising the minimum wage will reduce jobs. It'll create them, and more importantly, it returns some of the benefits that American workers deserve back to them that they've just been missing for the last 30 years. And that's not the only thing we should do. There's a lot of other things we should do, but it's a no-brainer first step.
So what I can add on this is that if we look at wages for college graduates Everyone talks about the growing college wage premium, that you're going to make so much more money if you go to college than if you don't. But really, if you look into the data, that growing premium is actually because non-college graduates' wages have been falling so quickly. It's not that college graduates' wages have actually increased when you adjust for inflation, which makes the issue of rising student loan debt even riskier. So ironically, it's somehow more important to go to college than ever, but maybe wages aren't growing at all while your debt is higher, and that is not a tenable situation.
And I would love to continue this conversation, and I think our panelists would be willing to talk to some people once they get back out on the floor, but we are out of time. So many questions on Twitter. You guys blew up my Twitter account. But we're gonna have to wrap up, and I hope we've done something to demystify these huge DC-specific seeming questions and helped you make some more connections and given you some great ways to fight back. So I want to thank all of our panelists and all of you for hanging out with us.